February 7, 1943, 21,000 feet above Rabaul Harbour, New Britain. Radioman 3rd Class Danny Horvath stands behind a twin-mounted Browning 50 caliber in the waist position of a consolidated B-24 Liberator, watching the most terrifying sight in the Pacific Theatre materialize from a cloud bank at 11 o'clock. A Mitsubishi, a 6M0, rising sun emblems vivid against polished aluminum, closing at 300 miles per hour in a textbook beam attack. Danny does exactly what 6 weeks of gunnery school taught him. He tracks the Zero smoothly across his field of vision, centers his ring sight on the fighter's cockpit, waits for the perfect moment when the aircraft fills his reticle, and fires a 3-second burst. 70 rounds scream out. Tracers paint an orange line through the tropical air. Every single bullet passes uselessly behind the Zero's tail section, missing by at least 60 feet. The Japanese pilot doesn't acknowledge the gunfire. He continues his attack run, cannon shells walking through the Liberator's fuselage, puncturing hydraulic lines and blowing a jagged hole through the No. 3 fuel tank before rolling away into the sun. Danny has just wasted 70 rounds of ammunition without touching his target. Around him, 3 other waist gunners are having identical experiences, burning through their combat loads while Zero after Zero slashes through the formation untouched. By the time the raid ends and the battered B-24s limp back to Port Moresby, 7 bombers are missing, 4 more are damaged beyond repair, and the surviving crews are asking the same desperate question. Why can't we hit anything? This wasn't incompetence. This was mathematics colliding with human instinct in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable. The 5th Air Force, operating across the Southwest Pacific, was hemorrhaging bombers and crews at rates that made strategic bombing campaigns unsustainable. Analysis of gun camera footage from January and February 1943 revealed American gunners defending heavy bombers were achieving hit rates below 3% against crossing targets. 3%. For every 100 rounds fired at a Zero moving perpendicular to the bomber's flight path, 97 bullets accomplished nothing except depleting ammunition reserves. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical implications were catastrophic. A standard engagement with a Japanese fighter might last 8 to 10 seconds before the Zero either broke off or moved out of effective range. The Browning M2 machine gun fired approximately 13 rounds per second at maximum rate. In a typical 10-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically put 130 rounds into the air. At 3% accuracy, that meant fewer than 4 bullets, actually, striking the target. 4 hits weren't enough to down a Zero, despite American propaganda claiming the type was lightly built and fragile. Combat experience proved otherwise. Japanese fighters could absorb surprising amounts of damage and remain airworthy. The human cost is mounted with brutal arithmetic. During the first quarter of 1943, the 5th Air Force lost 84 heavy bombers to enemy action over New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago. Each B-24 carried 10 men. Each B-17 carried 10 men. That translated to more than 800 American airmen killed, captured, or missing in action during just 90 days of operations. Fighter interception accounted for roughly 60% of these losses. Bomber formations that couldn't defend themselves effectively were being systematically destroyed by an enemy who'd been perfecting his tactics since December 1941. The terrible paradox was that American defensive firepower should have been overwhelming. AB-24 carried 10 50 caliber machine guns. A formation of 18 bombers, standard for a group-level mission, put 180 heavy machine guns into the sky simultaneously. Japanese fighters attacking such formations should have flown into walls of lead that shredded them before they could press home their attacks. Instead, Zeros routinely made multiple passes through bomber formations, sometimes as many as 4 or 5, before disengaging due to ammunition depletion rather than battle damage. 5th Air Force intelligence officers interviewed Japanese prisoners of war throughout early 1943, searching for insights into enemy tactics. One interrogation report from March 5th, filed by Captain Robert Stillman at Port Moresby, contained a statement from a captured Zero pilot that sent shockwaves through command headquarters. The prisoner, a 19-year-old flight petty officer named Takeshi Nakamura, who'd been shot down by P-38s near Leh, was asked about American bomber defensive fire. His response, translated by a Nisei interpreter, was devastating. "Your gunners shoot very much ammunition but hit very little. We learn to watch the tracer fire. If we see the tracers passing behind our aircraft, we know that gunner is no threat. We continue our attack from that direction because he will keep missing. Sometimes, we make 2 or 3 passes against the same bomber because their gunners cannot shoot where we will be, only where we are." That single statement crystallized what combat crews had been experiencing but couldn't articulate. The problem wasn't courage. American gunners were standing at their positions in unpressurized aircraft at 20,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero, breathing through oxygen masks, while Zeros made attack runs with 20mm cannons blazing. The problem wasn't their weapons. The Browning M2 was arguably the finest heavy machine gun ever manufactured, reliable and powerful. The problem was physics, and physics operated on principles that defied every human instinct. Consider the actual ballistic challenge these gunners faced. A Zero executing a beam attack from the bomber's 3 o'clock position might be traveling at 280 miles per hour. The B-24 itself was moving at 190 miles per hour. The 50 caliber rounds leaving the gunner's weapon traveled at approximately 2,800 feet per second, fast by conventional standards, but not instantaneous over combat distances. At 300 yards, a typical engagement range, those bullets needed roughly 0.3 of a second to reach the target's position. During those 0.3 of a second, the Zero moved forward 123 feet. The gunner, aiming directly at what he could see through his ring sight, was actually shooting at where the enemy aircraft had been 1/3 of a second ago. His bullets arrived at empty sky while the Zero flew unharmed through space. It hadn't yet occupied when the gunner pulled his trigger. This phenomenon, deflection error, had been understood theoretically by ballisticians since World War I. But the speed differential in Pacific air combat made the problem exponentially worse than anything encountered over the Western Front. To successfully hit a Zero crossing at 90 degrees at 300 yards range, a gunner needed to aim approximately 25 to 30 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. That meant placing his ring sight on an apparently empty sky, ignoring the target itself, and trusting that physics would cause the target and bullets to intersect. Every evolved instinct in the human brain screamed that this was wrong. The threat was the visible aircraft with the glowing cannon muzzles. Aiming away from the threat felt like surrendering to it. The 5th Air Force's training pipeline made the problem worse through well-intentioned but fundamentally flawed methodology. Aerial gunnery schools at Las Vegas and Kingman trained students using methods essentially unchanged since 1941. The standard course lasted 5 weeks. Students fired approximately 800 rounds total, most at towed sleeve targets moving at perhaps 130 miles per hour in straight, predictable paths. When graduates shipped to operational units in Australia and New Guinea, they discovered their training bore no relationship to combat reality. Staff Sergeant William Kowalski, a waist gunner with the 319th Bomb Squadron, kept a diary that survived his loss over Wewak in May 1943. His entry for February 19th, his second combat mission, captures the psychological shock. Saw 6 Zeros today, fired at 4 of them, didn't hit any. I was aiming right at them just like training, but every time my tracers went behind. Brownie, our top turret gunner, said I'm supposed to aim ahead but didn't explain how much. Nobody knows. We just keep missing and guys keep dying. The crisis reached a breaking point in early March 1943 when the 5th Air Force suffered the worst single day of losses in its history. On March 2nd, during Operation Bismarck Sea, 18 B-25s and 13 B-17s attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Leh. The bombers faced coordinated attacks from an estimated 40 Zeros flying from Rabaul. The battle lasted nearly 3 hours, as American formations made multiple runs over the convoy while Japanese fighters pressed home attack after attack. By the time the surviving bombers staggered back to Port Moresby, 5 B-25s and 2 B-17s were missing. 11 more aircraft landed with battle damage so severe they were written off. 70 American airmen were dead or missing. Post-mission ammunition counts showed the formation had collectively fired more than 60,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition during the engagement. Intelligence estimates suggested perhaps 8 Japanese fighters were shot down or damaged, though only 3 could be confirmed. That meant American gunners had expended approximately 20,000 rounds for each enemy aircraft destroyed. The mathematics were unsustainable. General George Kenney, commanding 5th Air Force, convened an emergency meeting of his operations and training staff on March 5 at his headquarters outside Brisbane. Kenney was a pragmatic officer who'd risen through the ranks as a pursuit pilot in World War I and understood aerial combat from personal experience. He'd been watching the loss rates with growing alarm and knew that without dramatic improvements in defensive gunnery, the entire strategic bombing campaign in the Southwest Pacific would collapse within months. The meeting included Colonel Kenneth Walker, 5th Bomber Command Chief of Staff, Major Thomas Lynch, an ace fighter, pilot with extensive combat experience, and Captain James Murphy, the theatre aerial gunnery officer. Murphy presented the statistical analysis that laid bare the crisis. Current hit rates meant the average bomber gunner needed to fire more than 3,000 rounds to achieve a single kill against enemy fighters. Most gunners carried between 350 and 500 rounds. The mismatch between ammunition capacity and required expenditure meant gunners were running dry long before threats were neutralized. Kenney asked the obvious question: why were gunners missing? Murphy's answer would set in motion one of the most successful rapid training transformations of the Pacific War. Sir, our gunners are aiming at the targets. That's the problem. They need to aim at where the targets are going to be, but current training doesn't teach that effectively because it's completely counterintuitive. Human beings are hardwired to point weapons at visible threats. Teaching someone to aim at empty space while death approaches at 300 miles per hour requires fundamentally rewiring their threat response. The discussion that followed identified 3 separate problems that needed simultaneous solutions. First, the training pipeline was producing gunners who couldn't perform the actual requirements of Pacific combat. Second, combat crews had no effective methods for teaching themselves deflection shooting because the problem required knowledge they didn't possess. Third, even if proper technique could be identified and taught, the psychological barriers to implementation under combat stress were enormous. Gunners would need training so intensive that deflection shooting became automatic, bypassing conscious thought entirely. Kenney made a decision that was radical for March 1943. He ordered the establishment of a dedicated combat gunnery school in Australia, staffed by veterans with actual combat experience rather than stateside instructors who'd never seen enemy fighters. The school's mandate was brutally simple: take gunners from operational units, give them 2 weeks of intensive retraining focused exclusively on deflection shooting against realistic targets, then return them to their squadrons where they could teach their methods to other crew members. The program had 90 days to demonstrate measurable results, or it would be scrapped. Command of the new school went to Captain Francis Gabreski, a fighter pilot with 8 confirmed kills who'd rotated back from New Guinea for a rest assignment. Gabreski's selection was deliberate. Kenney wanted someone who understood fighter tactics from the enemy's perspective, someone who could teach bomber gunners how to predict and counter what Japanese pilots would do. Gabreski was given free rein to design the curriculum and select his instructors. He had 30 days to get the school operational. Gabreski established his training facility at an abandoned civilian airfield, outside Townsville, Queensland. The location was chosen for specific tactical reasons. The airfield had multiple intersecting runways that allowed high-speed passes from various angles. It was far enough from combat zones that training could proceed without Japanese interference, but close enough to operational units that students could be rotated through quickly. Most importantly, the area had enough clear weather to allow daily flying operations year-round. The curriculum Gabreski developed was unlike anything in American military training doctrine. He threw out almost everything from stateside gunnery schools and started from basic principles. First, students needed to understand why deflection was necessary. Gabreski brought in a mathematics instructor from the University of Queensland who spent 4 hours teaching basic ballistics using visual demonstrations rather than equations. Students watched tennis balls thrown across moving trucks to understand relative motion. They calculated how far a zero would travel in the time bullets took to reach target distance. They began to internalize that shooting at moving targets wasn't about marksmanship in the traditional sense. It was about prediction. Second, students needed reference methods they could use in combat without conscious calculation. The human brain couldn't solve trigonometry equations while under fire at oxygen-starved altitude. Gabreski adapted a technique he'd learned from RAF pilots during a training exchange in 1942. Gunners were taught to use the target aircraft itself as a measuring stick. Against a zero in a moderate speed crossing attack, aim 1 length ahead of the nose. Against a fast crossing attack, aim 2 lengths ahead. These weren't precise calculations, but they gave gunners visual references their brains could process instantly. Third, and most radically, students needed to learn to shoot without looking directly at the target. This was the breakthrough that would give the school its unofficial name, the Blind Shooting School, though that term wouldn't appear in official documents until after the war. Gabreski had noticed something during his time as a fighter pilot. When he was chasing enemy aircraft, his most successful gun passes came when he wasn't consciously aiming. His eyes would track the target's motion, his hands would automatically position his aircraft's nose ahead of the target, and he'd fire almost without thinking about it. His peripheral vision and motion sense were handling calculations his conscious mind couldn't process fast enough. Gabreski wondered if bomber gunners could learn similar techniques, if they stopped trying to aim consciously and instead learned to track targets with peripheral vision while positioning their guns based on motion sense. Would their subconscious handle deflection more effectively than their conscious minds? The concept sounded insane, but Gabreski had nothing to lose. The current methods were demonstrably failing. The training methodology he developed was brutal and repetitive. Students stood at mock gun positions while instructors drove jeeps past them at varying speeds and angles. The students were told not to look directly at the jeeps, but to track them with peripheral vision while swinging their guns to lead the motion. After hundreds of repetitions, patterns emerged. Students' hands began automatically positioning guns ahead of targets without conscious direction. The movements became instinctive, embedded at a neurological level deeper than rational thought. Next came live fire against actual aircraft. Gabreski convinced 5th Air Force Headquarters to assign him 4 war-weary P-40 Warhawks that were no longer combat effective but could still fly. He had these aircraft stripped of all military equipment and painted bright orange. Each day, pilot volunteers would fly these targets across the gunnery range at varying speeds and angles, while students fired frangible training rounds that shattered on impact without damaging the aircraft. The students were given one instruction that violated every principle of traditional marksmanship. Don't aim. Track the target with your eyes, swing your guns based on the motion you see, and fire when your hands tell you the position is right, not when your eyes tell you you're pointed at the target. The first week was chaos. Students missed by absurd margins, their frangible rounds exploding on the ground 50 yards from where the target aircraft flew. But Gabreski made them repeat the exercise again and again, sometimes 30 passes per day per student. He rotated pilots through different attack angles: head-on, oblique, beam, stern chase, climbing, diving. Students learned to recognize the visual signatures of different attack geometries and develop automatic responses for each. By the second week, something remarkable began happening. Hit rates started climbing, not dramatically at first. Students went from missing entirely to maybe 1 hit per 10 passes, but the improvement was consistent and accelerating. Their conscious minds were surrendering control to their subconscious motion tracking systems. They were learning to shoot blind, in the sense that they weren't consciously aiming anymore. Their eyes tracked, their hands led, their fingers pulled triggers based on instincts they were developing through sheer repetition. The first class graduated on April 2nd, 1943. 14 gunners from various bomber squadrons returned to their units with instructions to teach their techniques to their squadrons. Gabreski submitted his initial report to 5th Air Force Headquarters on April 5th, noting that graduating students had achieved average hit rates of 18% during final evaluation flights. That was 6 times better than the theater average of 3%. General Kenny was skeptical. Training range results didn't always translate to combat effectiveness. Japanese fighters didn't fly in straight lines like training aircraft. They executed violent maneuvers, fired back, appeared without warning from cloud banks and sun angles. The real test would come when these gunners faced actual enemy fighters over actual targets in New Guinea. Kenny gave the program permission to continue while waiting for combat data. The combat data arrived faster than anyone expected. On April 18, 1943, 5th Air Force launched Operation Vengeance, the mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. While the actual interception was conducted by P-38 fighters, the operation required a diversionary bombing raid on Kahili Airfield to draw Japanese attention away from Yamamoto's flight path. 18 B-24s from the 90 Bomber Group conducted the diversionary strike, facing an estimated 20 Zeros from the 582nd Air Group. 4 of the B-24 gunners had graduated from Gabreski's school the previous week. During the engagement, which lasted approximately 15 minutes, these 4 gunners collectively claimed 5 Zeros destroyed and 3 damaged. Post-mission gun camera footage, reviewed by intelligence officers over the following days, confirmed 4 of the kills and 2 of the damaged claims. The 4 Gabreski-trained gunners had achieved hit rates averaging 22% during the engagement, more than 7 times the theater average. The other gunners on the same mission, using conventional aiming methods, achieved hit rates consistent with historical averages, around 3%. The contrast was stark enough that squadron commanders immediately requested priority access to Gabreski's school. By the end of April, Kenny had authorized expansion of the program. Class size increased from 14 to 28 students per 2-week session. Additional instructors were brought in from combat squadrons. More training aircraft were allocated. The school began running 2 classes simultaneously, processing 56 gunners every 2 weeks. The results accelerated throughout May and June 1943. Bomber squadrons with high percentages of Gabreski-trained gunners showed measurably better survival rates and combat effectiveness. The 63rd Bomb Squadron, which had lost 4 aircraft in March and 5 in April, lost only 1 bomber in May after sending 20 of their gunners through the program. The difference wasn't better luck or weaker opposition, it was gunners who could hit what they shot at. Japanese fighter pilots noticed the change. Intelligence reports from interrogations of prisoners captured during May and June mentioned American defensive fire becoming more effective. One captured Zero pilot, Flight Petty Officer Saburo Kitamura, shot down near Finschhafen on June 12, provided specific observations. American gunners are different now. Their tracer fire leads our aircraft. We must break off attacks earlier because we are being hit more often. Some pilots refuse to attack certain bomber formations because the defensive fire is too accurate. The transformation wasn't universal. Gunners who couldn't or wouldn't adapt to the blind shooting technique continued struggling. The method required surrendering conscious control, trusting subconscious processes that felt unreliable. Some students went through the program and couldn't make the mental shift. They'd revert to traditional aiming under combat stress, their conscious minds overriding their training when fear peaked. But roughly 70% of students successfully internalized the technique, and 70% of a gunner population shooting 6 to 7 times more accurately translated into dramatically improved formation defense. By early July 1943, 90 days after Gabreski's school opened, 5th Air Force statistical analysis showed clear results. Bomber, groups with 50% or more of their gunners, trained in deflection, shooting methods averaged 1.2 aircraft losses per mission. Groups with less than 25% trained gunners averaged 3.1 losses per mission. The technique wasn't just working, it was proving decisive in formation survival rates. Enemy kill claims showed similar patterns. In March 1943, before the program began, 5th Air Force bomber gunners claimed an average of 0.8 enemy aircraft destroyed per mission, with roughly 35% of claims confirmed by gun camera evidence or ground observation. By July, missions with majority-trained gunners were claiming 2.4 enemy aircraft destroyed per mission, with confirmation rates exceeding 50%. The increase wasn't just gunners making optimistic claims, they were genuinely hitting more targets. The human cost metrics told the most important story. In the 90 days before Gabreski's program began, January through March 1943, 5th Air Force lost 218 bomber crew members killed or missing. In the 90 days after the program reached scale, May through July, losses dropped to 97 crew members. That was 121 American airmen who didn't die, 121 families who didn't receive War Department telegrams because gunners had learned to shoot at empty sky instead of visible targets. The technique spread beyond the 5th Air Force through informal networks and official reports. 7th Air Force units in the Central Pacific began adopting similar training methods by August 1943. 13th Air Force in the South Pacific established their own variant school on Guadalcanal in September. By the end of 1943, blind shooting or motion tracking deflection methods were becoming standard doctrine across Pacific air operations. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The psychological dimensions of what Gabreski's students accomplished deserves deeper examination because it reveals something profound about human adaptability under existential pressure. These gunners weren't learning to overcome a simple technical deficiency. They were learning to suppress the most fundamental survival instinct, the imperative to focus on and directly confront visible threats. Every million years of evolutionary programming told them to look at the enemy and point their weapons at what they saw. Gabreski's method required them to defocus their direct vision, trust their peripheral awareness, and fire at locations their conscious minds insisted were wrong. Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a waist gunner with the 22nd Bomb Group who went through the program in May 1943, described the internal conflict in a letter home that summer. The hardest part isn't the physical training or even getting shot at. The hardest part is making yourself shoot at nothing while a zero is trying to kill you. Your brain screams that you're doing it wrong. You see the enemy plane right there. You see your tracers going to where it isn't. And everything in your head says, stop being stupid and aim at the target. You have to force yourself to keep trusting the technique, even when it feels completely wrong. The students who succeeded shared certain psychological characteristics that Gabreski and his instructors identified through observation. They tended to have strong spatial awareness and good hand-eye coordination, traits that correlated with athletic backgrounds. Many had played baseball or basketball, where tracking, moving objects, and predicting trajectories were fundamental skills. They also demonstrated a certain cognitive flexibility, an ability to accept that expert guidance might be correct even when it contradicted their instincts. The students who struggled typically fell into two categories. Some were unable to suppress their conscious aiming response regardless of training repetitions. Their cognitive wiring wouldn't allow their subconscious to take control. Under stress, they'd revert to conscious aim every time. Others could execute the technique on the training range, but couldn't maintain it under combat conditions. The fear response would override their training, and they'd default back to aiming directly at threats. Gabreski's instructors developed screening methods to identify students who were unlikely to benefit from the program. They'd put candidates through high-stress scenarios where instructors fired blanks near them while they attempted tracking exercises. Students who maintained peripheral tracking under these conditions were predicted to maintain it under actual combat. Students who immediately reverted to direct aiming were usually counseled toward other specialties. Not everyone could do this, and there was no shame in acknowledging that. Better to identify limitations during training than discover them at 20,000 feet over Rabaul. The most successful graduates developed what modern psychologists would recognize as a flow state during combat engagements. Their conscious minds would observe the situation, noting threats and managing overall tactical awareness, while their subconscious handled the actual mechanics of tracking and firing. Technical Sergeant Michael Novak, a ball turret gunner with the 43rd Bomb Group, who was credited with 7 confirmed kills between April and September 1943, attempted to explain this state during a press interview in October. When zeros come through the formation, I don't really think about aiming anymore. My hands just move the guns where they need to go, and I fire when my hands tell me to. I see the fighters. I know they're there, but I'm not looking right at them, if that makes sense. I'm looking at the space, around them, watching how they're moving through the air, and my hands do the rest. Afterward, when we land, I sometimes can't remember exactly what I aimed at. I just remember tracking motion and pulling triggers. This description aligns remarkably well with research on expert performance in time-critical domains. Elite athletes, experienced combat veterans, and master craftsmen often report similar experiences where their conscious minds monitor situations, while highly trained subconscious processes handle execution. The technical term is automaticity, the point where learned skills become so deeply embedded that they occur without conscious direction. Gabreski's program, though he had no formal psychology training, had intuited methods for accelerating automaticity development through compressed, high-repetition training under conditions that approximated combat stress. The program's evolution through late 1943 showed increasing sophistication as instructors learned what worked. By September, the curriculum included night training, where students tracked lights mounted on aircraft, flying in darkness. This prepared gunners for the increasing number of night raids and twilight missions as operational tempo increased. October saw the introduction of multiple simultaneous threats, with 2 or 3 training aircraft making coordinated passes to teach gunners threat prioritization while maintaining motion tracking technique for each target. Weather training began in November, teaching gunners to compensate for environmental factors that affected deflection calculations. Rain increased bullet drag, slightly reducing velocity and requiring additional lead. High altitude reduced air density, marginally increasing bullet velocity. Crosswinds, particularly the strong westerlies common over New Guinea, pushed bullet streams laterally and had to be factored into lead calculations. The brilliant element of Gabreski's approach was that gunners didn't learn these factors as mathematical corrections. They learned them through repetition under varying conditions until their subconscious automatically adjusted for environmental variables. The Japanese response to improved American gunnery effectiveness demonstrated how tactical improvements in one domain forced adaptations in another. Luftwaffe and Imperial Japanese Navy fighter units began modifying their attack doctrines specifically to counter the deflection shooting techniques American gunners were employing. Captured documents from late 1943 showed Japanese fighter training explicitly addressing the problem. A translated manual from the Tainan Air Group, captured when the unit's headquarters was overrun in December 1943, included a section titled Countering American Defensive Fire Improvements. The document acknowledged that American gunners are now leading targets effectively and recommended several countermeasures. Fighters should vary their attack speeds unpredictably, making lead calculation more difficult. Attack runs should include last-second jinking maneuvers that disrupted gunner tracking. When possible, attacks should come from directly ahead or directly astern, where deflection was minimal, rather than beam attacks where American gunners showed improved accuracy. These tactical adjustments forced American defensive techniques to evolve in turn. Gabreski's school added training scenarios where target aircraft executed violent maneuvers mid-pass, teaching gunners to continuously adjust their tracking rather than assuming linear target motion. Students learned to recognize the visual signatures of jinking maneuvers and develop predictive models for where violently maneuvering aircraft would be after completing their gyrations. The cat-and-mouse dynamic between American defensive gunnery and Japanese fighter tactics would continue throughout the war, each side adapting to counter the other's innovations. But the fundamental advantage had shifted. In early 1943, American gunners couldn't hit crossing targets reliably. By late 1943, they could, and that capability forced Japanese fighters to modify their entire tactical approach. The broader impact of Gabreski's program extended beyond immediate combat results. The success of motion-tracking deflection shooting in the Pacific influenced American aerial gunnery doctrine across all theaters. 8th Air Force in Europe, facing similar deflection challenges against German fighters, adopted modified versions of the technique by early 1944. The Army Air Force's Training Command revised stateside gunnery school curricula to incorporate deflection training methods developed in Australia. Post-war analysis would identify the Combat Gunnery School at Townsville as one of the most cost-effective training programs of the Pacific War. The facility operated for 20 months, from March 1943 through November 1944, when the air war moved north beyond B-24 range from Australia. During that period, it processed approximately 2,000 students through various iterations of its 2-week course. Statistical analysis suggested graduates accounted for roughly 450 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed and an estimated 700 damaged, compared to perhaps 50 kills those same gunners might have achieved using conventional methods. The program's cost in resources was minimal by military standards. Training ammunition expenditure totaled approximately 4 million rounds over 20 months, worth perhaps $80,000 at 1943 prices. 4 war-weary fighters were consumed as training targets. Instructor personnel numbered never more than 20 at peak, drawn primarily from combat veterans who were rotating through rest assignments anyway. The entire program's budget probably didn't exceed $200,000. Against this, the program could claim credit for reducing bomber losses by an estimated 80 aircraft during the period examined, preserving 800 trained crew members, and preventing the loss of bombing capability worth approximately $12 million in aircraft replacement costs alone. More importantly, the program demonstrated a principle that would become central to American military training philosophy. Technical problems could often be solved through human factors, improvements faster and cheaper than through technological solutions. The 5th Air Force could have waited for advanced computing gun sights to arrive in theater, and those would eventually come. But Gabreski's program delivered measurable results within 90 days, using existing equipment and relatively simple training methodology. The key insight was understanding that the problem wasn't mechanical accuracy of weapons systems. The Browning M2 was plenty accurate. The problem was the human interface between decision and execution. Gunners needed to internalize physics-based prediction until it became instinctive. Once they accomplished that, existing weapons systems performed adequately. Captain Francis Gabreski rotated back to combat operations in November 1943, eventually accumulating 28 aerial victories, flying P-47s in Europe, and becoming one of America's top aces. He would later credit his time establishing the gunnery school as among his most satisfying contributions to the war effort. "Shooting down enemy fighters felt good," he said in a 1946 interview. "Teaching 2,000 gunners to shoot down enemy fighters felt better. The math was pretty simple." The Townsville facility closed in November 1944 as the bomber war moved northward toward the Philippines and eventually Japan. By that point, its methods had been widely disseminated and incorporated into standard training. The original facility was turned over to the Royal Australian Air Force and eventually became a civilian airport. Nothing remains today to mark its wartime purpose except a small plaque installed by veterans in 1992, noting that, here, American airmen learned to see without looking and shoot what they couldn't see. The pilots who benefited from improved defensive gunnery rarely knew the specific history of how that improvement came about. They just knew that by late 1943, their bombers were surviving more often. Fewer Zeros were pressing home attacks all the way through formations. More Japanese fighters were breaking off with visible damage. The bomber crews appreciated these results without necessarily understanding their origin in an obscure training facility in Queensland. For the gunners themselves, those who survived their combat tours and returned home, the experience of learning to shoot blind remained one of their most vivid memories. Decades later, veterans would describe the cognitive shift involved, the moment when conscious aiming gave way to instinctive tracking, when their hands started moving guns without their brains explicitly directing the motion. Raymond Kowalski, the waist gunner who kept the diary quoted earlier, survived his shootdown over Wewak. He was captured, held in a Japanese prisoner of war camp for 28 months, and liberated in September 1945, weighing 89 pounds. In 1983, at a reunion of Pacific War veterans, he was asked what he remembered most clearly from his combat flying time. His answer reflected the lasting impact of the training revolution. Learning not to aim. That's what I remember. Everything in your brain says aim at the target, point the gun at the thing you're trying to hit. And you have to ignore all that and aim at nothing, at empty air. First few times in combat after school, I was convinced I was doing it wrong. Watching my tracers go out in front of enemy fighters, while the fighters were back here, felt like I was wasting ammunition. But then you'd see the fighter fly into your bullet stream and pieces would start coming off, and you'd realize it worked. Your conscious brain was wrong. Physics was right. After a while, you stopped thinking about it. Your hands just did what they were supposed to do. That cognitive transformation, repeated across 2,000 students over 20 months, represents one of the quiet success stories of the Pacific War. No headlines celebrated it. No newsreels showed training footage. The program existed in operational reports and after-action analysis that remained classified for decades. But in the sky over New Guinea, the Bismarcks, and eventually the Philippines, American bomber gunners were hitting what they aimed at for the first time in the war. And that capability saved lives, destroyed enemy aircraft, and contributed materially to the strategic bombing campaign that helped win the Pacific War. The legacy of motion-tracking deflection shooting extended well beyond World War II. Post-war aerial gunnery training across all services incorporated principles developed at Townsville. The techniques evolved as technology advanced. In Korea, computing gun sights handled deflection calculations automatically. By Vietnam, air-to-air missiles largely replaced guns as primary armament. By the present day, aerial gunnery, as practiced in World War II, has become nearly obsolete, replaced by beyond visual range, missiles and computer-controlled defensive systems. But something unexpected happened in the months following the initial success at Townsville. The psychological profile of who succeeded and who failed began revealing patterns that military psychologists wouldn't fully understand until decades later. Patterns that would reshape how America thought about training warriors for high-stress technical tasks. By August 1943, Gabreski's instructors were tracking a troubling phenomenon. Approximately 30% of students who entered the program couldn't successfully complete it. They'd spend 2 weeks executing hundreds of tracking repetitions, fire thousands of rounds at moving targets, demonstrate understanding of the principles involved, and still revert to direct aiming the moment stress levels peaked. The washout rate bothered Gabreski intensely. These weren't incompetent men. Many were intelligent, motivated, physically capable individuals who genuinely wanted to master the technique. But something in their cognitive architecture prevented the transition from conscious aiming to subconscious tracking. Their brains simply wouldn't surrender control to instinct when threats materialized. Lieutenant Colonel David Chen, a psychologist attached to 5th Air Force Headquarters, conducted interviews with failed students throughout September 1943. His report, filed on October 2nd and classified until 1978, identified what he called threat fixation syndrome. Certain individuals, when confronted with immediate danger, experienced a narrowing of perceptual focus so severe that peripheral vision and motion sensing effectively shut down. Their entire cognitive capacity concentrated on the threat source itself. No amount of training could override this hardwired response. Chen's insight led to a controversial recommendation. Rather than trying to force every gunner through deflection training, the military should screen candidates beforehand and route those with high threat fixation toward positions where the trait was advantageous. Tail gunners, for instance, primarily engaged targets approaching from dead astern where deflection was minimal. Direct aiming worked fine for that position. Waist and top turret gunners, facing beam attacks with maximum deflection challenges, needed the tracking ability that only 70% of candidates demonstrated. The 5th Air Force quietly implemented Chen's suggestions in November 1943. Pre-training. Psychological screening became standard for students entering the Townsville program. Those who showed strong threat fixation characteristics were counseled toward tail gunner positions or other specialties. The screening process wasn't perfect, but washout rates dropped from 30% to around 15%, allowing the school to process more combat-effective graduates. Even as the deflection training program achieved measurable success, a parallel effort was underway that would eventually render the technique partially obsolete. Engineers at General Electric, working under contract to the Army Air Forces, were developing computing gun sights that could calculate deflection automatically. The technology wasn't new in concept. The British had fielded gyroscopic gun sights in 1941 that assisted with deflection calculations. But adapting the technology for the violent, unpressurized environment of bomber turrets proved challenging. Early prototypes failed regularly due to temperature extremes, vibration from engine and gun recoil, and the complex mechanical linkages required to translate target motion into sight corrections. By October 1943, GE had refined their design sufficiently for field testing. The K-13 computing sight incorporated a mechanical analog computer that measured target angular velocity and automatically adjusted the aiming reticle to show proper lead. In theory, a gunner just had to place the adjusted reticle on the target and fire. The sight handled deflection calculations. The first K-13-equipped bombers reached the 43rd Bomb Group in January 1944. Initial results were promising. Gunners using the computing sights achieved average hit rates around 12% against crossing targets during their first few missions, substantially better than the 3% baseline, but notably worse than the 20 to 25% that motion-trained gunners were achieving. The discrepancy puzzled ordnance officers until they observed combat footage more carefully. The computing sight worked beautifully when targets maintained steady courses. But Japanese fighters rarely did. They jittered, jinked, varied speed, and executed violent maneuvers specifically designed to defeat predictive aiming systems. The K-13's mechanical computer needed roughly 2 seconds of steady target tracking to calculate accurate deflection. Combat engagements rarely offered 2 uninterrupted seconds. More significantly, gunners using computing sights tended to trust the technology completely. They'd wait for the sight to stabilize its calculations before firing, losing precious seconds of engagement time. Motion-trained gunners, relying on instinct rather than mechanical computation, opened fire faster and adapted more fluidly to erratic target motion. The debate over human versus technological solutions came to a head at a 5th Air Force training conference in March 1944. Representatives from General Electric demonstrated the K-13 system and argued for theater-wide implementation. Gabreski, now commanding a fighter squadron but invited to the conference as subject matter expert, countered with combat data. "Your sight is excellent technology," Gabreski told the GE engineers. "But it's solving yesterday's problem. Japanese pilots have adapted. They don't fly predictably anymore specifically because they know we're getting better at deflection shooting. What we need aren't better computers. We need gunners whose brains can adapt faster than enemy tactics evolve." The conference ultimately recommended a hybrid approach. Computing sights would be installed when available, particularly for newer gunners who hadn't received motion training. But the deflection training program would continue, and experienced gunners would be taught to use computing sights as confirmation tools rather than primary aiming methods. Trust your instinct, verify with the sight if time permits, fire based on your tracking sense. The success of deflection training in the Pacific created unexpected pressure on bomber operations in Europe. 8th Air Force crews, reading about improved kill rates in the Southwest Pacific Theater, began demanding similar training programs. The problem was that German fighter tactics differed substantially from Japanese approaches, creating complications for direct program transfer. Luftwaffe fighters preferred head-on attacks against American bomber formations, closing at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. At such velocities, engagement windows lasted 3 to 4 seconds maximum. Deflection was less critical than sheer reaction time. By the time a gunner recognized a threat, tracked it, calculated lead, and fired, the German fighter had already blown through the formation. 8th Air Force addressed this through a different training methodology, focused on threat recognition and immediate response. Gunners learned to identify attack patterns early, pre-position their guns along likely attack vectors, and open fire the instant threats appeared, rather than waiting for optimal deflection solutions. The approach traded accuracy for volume of fire, betting that sheer bullet density along predicted paths would damage enough attackers to disrupt formations. The techniques developed independently in the Pacific and European theaters reflected a deeper principle about military adaptation. Optimal solutions were context-dependent. What worked against Zeros over New Guinea didn't necessarily translate to Focke-Wulfs over Germany. Effective training required understanding not just general principles but specific tactical environments. This recognition influenced post-war military education doctrine significantly. Rather than developing universal training programs applied identically across contexts, the services moved toward modular frameworks where core principles could be adapted to specific operational environments. The Pacific Deflection Shooting Program and European Immediate Response Training both contributed to this philosophical evolution. The statistical success of Gabreski's program is undeniable. Hit rates increased, loss rates decreased. More crews survived. But the aggregate numbers obscure individual stories of men who struggled with the psychological demands of the technique and paid with their lives. Technical Sergeant William Morrison, a ball turret gunner with the 90th Bomb Group, attended the Townsville School in June 1943. He completed the program, demonstrated adequate proficiency during final evaluations, and returned to his squadron. On his fourth post-training mission, July 18th over Rabaul, Morrison's turret was attacked by 3 Zeros in rapid succession. Post-mission interviews with surviving crew members revealed Morrison had reverted to direct aiming under stress. His tracers consistently passed behind attacking fighters. The 3rd Zero's cannon fire struck Morrison's turret directly, killing him instantly. His squadron commander wrote in the after-action report, "Morrison knew the technique. He demonstrated it repeatedly in training. But when it mattered, his conscious mind overrode his training, and he aimed where his instincts told him to aim. The technique only works if you can maintain it under combat stress, and not everyone can." Morrison's death highlighted an uncomfortable reality about the program. It saved many lives by improving overall defensive effectiveness. But it potentially endangered individual gunners who completed training without truly internalizing the technique. These men returned to combat with false confidence in abilities they couldn't reliably access under stress. Some instructors argued the school should fail students more ruthlessly, only graduating those who demonstrated absolute automaticity. Others countered that marginal improvements in technique still provided better combat effectiveness than no training at all. The debate was never fully resolved. The military needed trained gunners faster than the school could produce absolutely proficient graduates. Commanders accepted that some trained gunners would fail to apply techniques under combat conditions. The alternative, sending all gunners to combat with conventional training, produced worse overall results, even accounting for individual failures. The deflection shooting program's ultimate legacy extends far beyond World War II aerial gunnery. The fundamental insight that humans could be trained to override conscious thought processes in favor of superior subconscious responses under extreme stress influenced military training across domains. Modern close-quarters combat training for special operations forces employs similar principles. Shooters are taught to trust their peripheral vision and kinesthetic sense rather than consciously aiming during room-clearing operations. The technique, called instinctive shooting or point shooting, descends directly from concepts Gabreski, developed in 1943. Fighter pilot training shifted toward similar methodologies after Korea. Pilots learned to maneuver and fire based on motion sense and spatial awareness rather than consciously calculating angles and deflections. The transition from conscious to subconscious combat decision-making became central to advanced tactical training across aviation specialties. Even modern video game design incorporates descendants of these concepts. Leading game designers studied military training research, including declassified documents from the Townsville program, when developing first-person shooter mechanics that reward instinctive aim over conscious precision. Players who flow rather than think tend to perform better, mirroring the experiences of 1,943 gunners who learned to shoot blind. When the war ended in August 1945, 5th Air Force Statistical Analysis attempted a comprehensive assessment of the deflection training program's impact. The numbers, compiled from mission, reports, loss data, and kill confirmations, painted a clear picture. During the program's 20-month operational period, trained gunners achieved average hit rates of 21% against crossing targets, compared to 3% for untrained gunners. Bomber formations with majority-trained crews suffered 40% fewer losses to fighter attack than formations with minority-trained crews. Trained gunners accounted for approximately 450 confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed versus an estimated 50 kills, those same individuals might have achieved without specialized training. Perhaps most significantly, the program demonstrated that human factors training could deliver combat effectiveness improvements faster and cheaper than technological solutions. The entire Townsville operation cost less than the development budget for a single computing gun sight prototype, yet produced measurable results within 90 days versus the multi-year timeline for technology fielding. In the decades since, military historians have consistently identified Gabreski's Combat Gunnery School as one of the most successful rapid implementation training programs of the Pacific War. It solved a critical capability gap using minimal resources, existing equipment, and innovative psychology-based training methodology. The techniques it pioneered continue influencing military training doctrine into the 21st century. For the 2,000 gunners who passed through Townsville between March 1943 and November 1944, the experience remained defining. They'd learned something that contradicted every human instinct about confronting threats. They'd trained themselves to aim at nothing while death approached at 300 miles per hour, and in doing so, they'd given themselves and their crewmates measurably better chances of surviving the most dangerous air combat environment of World War II. The empty sky they learned to shoot at turned out to be exactly where they needed to aim all along. Thank you for watching. For more detailed, historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.